was trying to call you. Okay. Right, we'll start with Ben, then
Ben
we go.
Maria, then Jose Padua.
So Ben,
Maria, Ben Maria,
Maria, sorry.
no, she's there. And then Jose Padua.
And then okay. I've been given the wonderful job of moderating. It's the first time for everything. So introducing Benjamin de Loenen. Ben studied audiovisual media and communication in the Netherlands, where he graduated with honours in his master's with his documentary Ibogaine Rite of Passage in 2004, a film that would become a world reference about this subject matter until today. Ben worked as a film director and editor in the field of television, documentary publicity and fiction from 2004 to 2010, while he traveled the world as a public speaker about Iboga and ayahuasca. He organized the International Ibogaine Conference at the Catalan Health Ministry, gave courses about Ibogaine for health professionals and government agencies such as a Portuguese governmental institution, CICAD, and served the board of directors of GITA, the Global Ibogaine Therapy Alliance. Since the production of his film, he has been dedicated to the advancement of Ibogaine and ayahuasca as a therapeutic and personal development tool in contemporary society. He is a founder and executive director of the International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research and Service, ICEERS. Introducing Ben.
Thank you. Let me just stand on the other side. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's always great to be here with the International Ibogaine family. I'd hoped to be here with some more data to present on an initiative that we have that I'm going to talk about. And it's really two of my colleagues who are leading this, not me. It's Ricard Faura and Andrea Langlois. They are leading this project. And so basically I'm going to share a bit about what this is all about. And then I have one goal at the end, which I will share, which hopefully will work in this conference to get you all to do one little thing. So if you can go to the next one. So I was looking at an interview with Elon Musk the other day, and he was asked about life, and he said that the important thing in life is learning how to ask the right questions, because that's really what leads you to the way where you need to go. And so that's really what this project is about, that we started. Basically, it came out of the last conference held in Vienna. It showed that there was kind of a need to really get a sense of what is, to asking questions as a community, and to through that come to a shared vision for what the future for Ibogaine looks like, no? Because in our society, obviously, a lot of these compounds, Ibogaine and also ayahuasca and others, the relationship that we have as a society with them is one where it's generally misunderstood. There's very often prosecution. It's seen as a threat to public health. So how can we shift the relationship that our society has with these psychoactive plants? No, that's what our mission is in the organization that I represent, which is called ICEERS. And for those of you who don't know, we have been working since we almost exist for a decade now, and we've working mainly around Iboga and ayahuasca, and also more locally cannabis in Spain. So basically in the conference, the last conference, there was a whole discussion, and we saw that there's really a need to kind of stop for a moment and to get all our heads together and think about what is with Ibogaine in this current state, and what could be, and how can we move to the right direction. So in kind of building, in asking as a collective the right questions together, and that's how we build a vision for the future. And then out of that, you can really start to implement concrete strategies to make it happen. So that's kind of what this project is about, but also building bridges at the same time by doing this all together to really connect and making sure that we, the different stakeholders, different people and resources in the community, that we all kind of align that into a common strategy for the future. And And so, you know, if within those questions you kind of put all the little blocks together of information, of perspectives, of everything you can get out of that, you really automatically start to build around the future, you know, that you need to go towards. No, so it's really about, and you know, this whole process of getting the community involved in defining and shaping the vision for the future is something we've started to dedicate more and more attention to in ICEERS in our work over the years. With the ayahuasca communities, we've been working on this in different countries. There's a lot of providers and a lot of activity, much more than Ibogaine, obviously. But kind of engaging with those communities and really, you know, starting together, think about what is really the future we want to see, no? And how can we make it happen is something we've been engaging with in the last years. And it's really quite spectacular how sometimes you really shift, you know, perspectives altogether and how you then make them reality. So that's where we're at. So if you can pass the next. So the objectives of this project is, on one hand, to bring these multiple perspectives together. And by bringing them together, you create new understandings of critical issues. So obviously, you know, sustainability, ecology and so forth is very important here. But also about how to maximize benefits while minimizing risks, no, avoiding adverse situations. And then also looking more at the policy side of things on how to push things forward around Ibogaine in the policy environment. At the same time, you know, when you kind of start to engage with the community and asking those questions, you're starting to build trust, no, and solidarity, and kind of this mentality of being able to together ask those questions and critical questions and moving more together as a collective. And then hopefully, you know, at the end of this, we can get a clear sense of directions, things we need to really further explore or start to put into action and work towards in a more kind of internationally coordinated manner. And so, yeah, the impact that we hope with this is that on one hand, this kind of the first step, well, not the first step because this has been going on for a long time, but kind of a step into building a stronger community, more aligned community. And at the same time, as I said, getting a better sense of what is at this moment, really what's going on, what do people feel is going on and feel it needs to change. And then, you know, how do we put that into practice? So in terms of the methodology, so this is a bit the way it works. So at this point, we are here in the online survey, but it has started with a literature review and document review of everything we found available of interest. We have an advisory committee. Some of you here are in that committee who have been helping us to get you know, these documents and get feedback on these different parts of the process. And also, it's important to note that the researchers who are leading this, they're very experienced in research and in community processes, but quite naive to the Ibogaine community, so they have a fresh perspective, which is important because some of us who have been around for quite a while, we have our ideas about what is and where it should go, but maybe that's not what the majority shares, no? There can be blind spots. Then after that, we started to do individual interviews. These are semi-structured interviews with different people of different profiles, looking really at their kind of in-depth view of things. And then we've done focus groups. So focus groups are groups of different people. They don't know each other. We did two, one with patients, so people who did Ibogaine for drug dependency treatment, and another one for more psychospiritual uses. So they don't know each other. You really want to have a diversity in terms of gender and race and kind of the kind of a global presence. So we have done them through the Zoom rooms, so it's online, and basically explored a lot of the topics with those groups. Now, they were very fascinating. One fascinating thing was that probably, you know, we always think that there's a lot of people do Ibogaine in clinical settings, but it seems like there's much more people also doing it by themselves. And then also, I think the psychospiritual group of people who, you know, drank ayahuasca, did other plants, and now have come to Ibogaine or Iboga, I think is growing very fast. No? So there's a whole issue around that as well. Well, before, really kind of Ibogaine was always more in the corner of drug dependency treatment. I think that's now changing really fast. And so with that come certain questions around also sustainability. What's the pressure going to be on the natural resources, but also people who are they're used to doing things like sweat lodges before or fasting. Is that that's not the best idea to do that before Ibogaine in the same way, or Iboga. So with that also come a whole new set of things we need to address. Then the next step, so that's what we're doing now, is the online survey. So basically, out of everything we captured, we then, there's a design for different profiles of people getting questions. So, and we are pushing that out now as much as possible, so that people can respond, giving their vision of things, and information. And then at the end, the last step will be, with all of that, we will hold dialogue sessions with experts of different profiles together, and then really discuss that in group, the results of the surveys, but also things we've captured in the processes before. And then with all of that, we will write the reports, do the final analysis of everything, and then write the report. And in terms of stakeholders, we're looking at, on one hand, treatment providers, both for addiction treatment and psychospiritual, Ibogaine vendors or manufacturers, activists, NGO representatives, also regulatory agencies or people close to those agencies, scientific researchers, and then people who have done Ibogaine or Iboga. Just also briefly to mention that, so next slide is that ICEERS is, for those who you don't know, we're a charitable non-profit organization with United Nations consultative status, or ECOSOC status. And so none of the people involved in ICEERS have economic interest. We don't work with Ibogaine or with any other plants. So that's important to notice. So we're doing this from kind of a neutral stance, trying to really capture these different views and opinions of people, and to then put it into the public domain for people to work on. So if you can go to the next one. So really, the idea is to have an open source document at the end we will publish, and then hopefully in the next conference or so be able to discuss and maybe in working groups discuss the results and lay out altogether strategies for the different players to collaborate on. So this is the important part of this presentation. So I hope all of you can go to this link. It's a bit long. It's news.iceers.org, and then /Ibogaine Community Engagement Initiative Survey. I don't know if we can also post this on the social networks. It's not a very long way. It depends on your profile. You will get to other questions. But really, it's crucial that we have enough people here responding to this for this outcome to be successful. So if you can really fill this out, also on the next slide, this is also our Facebook page. So we have there a post, so you can share in your networks. But that's kind of really critical that at this point, everybody helps getting this out, responding it, whether you're a treatment provider or you've done Ibogaine, or if any other implication, you're an activist, policy reform, or whatever it is, to fill this out so we can really gather your perspectives. And so the outcome of this will be, on one hand, this is the full assessment report, which is the one we're going to make available, and then out of that also extract a scientific publication, and then afterwards present the results, obviously, with the aim to have discussion and as a community to really lay out strategies for the future. One thing to mention is that we initially had thought of doing also a field trip to Gabon and Cameroon to capture also the indigenous voices, and obviously we know that there's issues around sustainability going on in Gabon. We tried to get that included in the project, but it was way more complicated. So we figured this is really important to dedicate a next phase. So once we finish this, the idea is to fundraise and then have a more robust setup to go there, do field work, collaborate with some of the organizations like Blessings of the Forest and some others who have been working there around this issue, and to really also get a sense from the indigenous voices and people there about how do they view the internationalization of Ibogaine, what are the issues emerging there with us, getting the Ibogaine here and getting it more into the spotlight and having the demand that grows. So that's hopefully for later in 2019 that we will do that. The timeline is a bit that I think in February, March, probably we'll have this closed and have the report finished. and then starting to really shape the next phase for Gabon. So I'm gonna leave it here. Maybe if you have questions or anything, or maybe it's afterwards the questions.
I think we can fire a few questions.
Okay. See, you all are digesting food. There's no question. We pass to the next one. Okay.
Is this the thing you guys are doing for Gita or something? Or is that different?
So Gita, has been an organization which I don't know if everybody here knows, or if I wasn't here the last day, so I don't know if there was a lot of conversation about that. So basically, to give you a bit of background information for everybody, in 2009 there was a conference in Sayolita, which earlier was talked about, which there was this initiative. People came together. Howard Lotsov was diagnosed with cancer, was in his last days. So kind of to honor his work and thinking of the importance for the community to unite, people got together. They started with what was first called IFLIP, or the Ibogaine International Federation. IFLIP, no? That was the name. Or IFIP. And so that was, and that then turned into GITA, the Global Ibogaine Therapist Alliance at some point, which Jonathan Dickinson for a long time tried to push forward. Claire Wilkins has been, and Doug have been very, very active in that. And that's still existing. At this point, a bit in a state, kind of, figuring out what the next steps should be. So this initiative is really looking at the different actors and also the resources that are available. How can we align that in a more common strategy? What is the role for Gita to play in all of this, no? And how does that relate to, say, Blessings of the Forest, working around in indigenous or the sustainability issue in Gabon? Who else is out there working? Also individuals, and how instead of people doing their thing, can we further align it really based on a more systematic, analysis of what is, no? What are the things, the views of people? Where do people feel things, are not going well or need to be improved, or where are important resources that are available? I'm a big fan of this woman who started up the Pachamama Alliance, Lynn Twist. I don't know if you know her, but she worked very long in the Hunger Project, trying to deal with hunger. She's written several books, and she talks about that very often we're in this mindset of scarcity. I didn't have enough sleep last night. We don't have enough money. We don't have this. It's like everything we don't have, this mindset of scarcity. And she worked in very poor communities, sometimes really having problems, even having water, in desert areas. And really focusing about this feeling of sufficiency of, okay, we don't have money, or we didn't have enough sleep, but what do we have, no? And how can we really focus on the resources that we have available? Can be money, can be knowledge, can be networks, can be different things, and really align that very strategically to resolve the issues that are presenting. And for me that's very inspiring, because I think as an international community, that's exactly what we need to do as much as possible. That's why these venues, these conferences, these meetings are important, but really focusing on what are the resources that we have available, and how can we get a clarity, and real clarity, not just what my opinion is or your opinion, but more structured, getting a sense of what is. And then, so it's a long answer to your question, but basically the hope is that, yes, so that afterwards we can figure out what is the role for Gita to play, for other organizations, other people, and all really point towards a lot of people here have been saying, we need clinical research. I think that's one part of the story. There's some other parts of the story, so that's really what we're kind of digging to the surface. This one there, yeah. Well, I'm not the right person to answer, but I think they're officially a CIC, it's like a benefit corp, no? Yeah. So it's like a public B Corp or public benefit corporation, I think. Okay.
Thank you, Ben. Round of applause for Ben. We're very lucky to have him in the house. Okay, so introducing Maria Carvalho. Maria has worked her butt off here voluntarily, and I think she deserves a very big round of applause. Maria is a psychologist and lecturer at the Faculty of Education and Psychology at the Catholic University of Porto. She is vice president of the International Centre for Ethnobotanical Education, Research and Service, ICEERS, and she coordinates Project Cosmic Care at Boom Festival, has coordinated it since 2010. She is a founding member of the Cosmic Care Association that she currently presides. She is author of a number of academic publications in the fields of drug use, recreational environments, harm reduction, and therapeutic potential of teacher plants. Introducing Maria Carvalho.
So, good afternoon to you all. We've been spending some time these days. I'm actually very happy because I don't remember sitting in a table with with Ben. I don't think it's happened those many times over the years, and also with José Padua. My presentation today will make an effort to talk to you a little bit about the context of the how did the Portuguese decriminalization law came about. I tried to make somehow a short overview historically, a short one, and we will also try to share with you some available data concerning the evidence around the impact that the law has had, and hopefully highlight some current challenges that we are still facing. I cannot, however, start without taking the chance to tell you a little bit about Portugal, that by now I'm pretty sure you're all aware it's a different country from Spain. Sometimes that is not always that is not always clear. We are an old country founded in the 12th century. Somehow this is our national symbol. Don't really know exactly why. It's a cock, a colorful one. We are known for Fado, which is this really sentimental, typical, beautiful song. It talks about a feeling of longing, and it has a difficult translation. Actually, it's the word saudade. We have like beautiful landscapes. This one is on in the south of the country. It's usually very, very crowded. So psychonauts usually also look for the north landscapes. They are very prone to inspire psychedelic experiences in the wild. Since the revolution, Portugal has always been ruled either by one of these two parties. They're all central parties, one central left and one central right. So there has been very little political diversity. This guy has been in jail. He's been currently prosecuted. He was in charge of the government for a long time. He is responsible, actually, in a high part for the political and financial arrest that our country has been between 2011 2014 approximately. Nowadays we are ruled by a coalition of left parties, central left, but also Communist Party and the New Left Party. In the perspective of some people, this has been good news. Economical and financial recovery has been happening, and it's been good to, as usually, not only having one party decide on what's going on. So this has been negotiated over this last mandate. Also, perhaps relevant to know that Portugal has a totally free health system since 1978. We have been able to, although it's many fragilities, it has been a good example of public service in the protection of health. It was inspired initially in the French model, and it has been preserved up to these days with well, some compromise, of course, but still keeping a lot of its integrity. Portugal has recently approved same-sex marriage, also same-sex adoption. Women can make an interruption of their pregnancies if they choose so, up to the 10th week. And the law about euthanasia is currently being discussed. So I think there are some characteristics here that explain a little bit of the cultural environment that we live in the Portuguese society, perhaps a bit uncommon for a Southern European Catholic country. Some important achievements have been possible over the years. Another fact is that the current UN Secretary General is also a Portuguese man, a man known for his humanitarian work. He has been very active in the field of refugees before he was in the before he was UN Secretary General. Maybe it's also useful to know that in Portugal there is not a single party from left to right that opposes, for example, that refugees are welcomed in the country. And this is, I believe, in the current European situation, also kind of a bit unique. So, talking about what has brought us here today, how was the drug scene before 2001? We don't exactly know because no evidence on epidemiology was available at that point and before 2001. Even so, there are a number of historical and social facts that we can discuss to present a little bit the context of what was existing before the law was approved. There's historical facts that also can help a little bit to contribute to this history. This is Garcia da Horta. He joined a Portuguese explorer responsible for the expansionist and exploratory movement in India. He was a botanist, and he actually compiled a lot of evidence about plants in India that were published in the 16th century. We were also a bit in a bad situation in the Opium Wars because we were historical allies of the British, but at the same time we had very important commercial positions for our small economy in China. So this was kind of a tricky position for us during the Opium Wars. We were very active in transporting opium in that territory, and our economy really relied a lot in the opium market. We had kind of a soft hippie movement because we were under a dictatorship at the time. We were kind of naive in terms of drugs. A little came in the Portuguese society for youth in the 60s and 70s. However, we did have our first kind of Woodstock vibe going on in 1971 where mix of traditional folklore bands and Manfred Mann could be heard all together in the same event. So these were my parents actually in that period. I couldn't resist putting them in. So this is the first anti-drugs campaign in the Portuguese society. And actually this was before the revolution. It was labeled Droga, Loucura, Morte. So it was this kind of association, very basic moral panics association between drugs, madness, and death. And this was spread out all over Lisbon, these post signs. They were kind of calling attention to the fact that drugs would kill you and would make you crazy, but there was absolutely no evidence for this. There was not a noticeable problem of drug use in the Portuguese society before 1974, but there was anecdotal references to drug use. Actually, what is considered as the real motivation for this first anti-drugs campaign was not the problem of drug use itself, but the fear that youth would be somehow involved in the revolution that was about to come very early, very quickly from that point. Immediately after the revolution, things were a little bit different. So Portugal had to welcome a huge wave of national refugees that would be escaping from the war in Africa, from the colonial war in Africa. These people brought with them the costume of smoking, the African varieties of marijuana. They had even specific names that were popular in Portugal at the time. Suruma and liamba were expressions used for cannabis. It was just very good cannabis that actually arrived in Portugal at that time. This was a problem that was very quickly, so that there was no trafficking organized in the Portuguese society. So this was basically what people were bringing with them, and it quickly disappeared, no, as a as a major use fact. However, it got kind of popular to smoke and quite more disseminated the use of cannabis in the Portuguese society, and this motivated the second campaign. So a campaign where in the television you could be asked by the government that if you notice this plant, then destroy it because it's poisonous, it's a drug, and because people kind of initiated the habit of growing themselves. Then popular culture started to speak about drug use at this point. And there was not exactly still after 1974 an organized drugs market, but it started to be popular to find some people wanting to experience with substances, mainly pharmaceuticals, amphetamines and opiates, that they actually stole from pharmacies, from official pharmacies. So the habit of stealing pharmacies or doing pharmacies, fazer farmácias in Portugal, did you do a couple of those? or you would take just your parents' pills to lose weight or something. And these were like very popular habits. And actually what happened was that this at some point was such a popular habit among the youth that it intensified and it became a problem for a number of youngsters in the post-revolutionary period. And the first junkies in Portugal actually started by being these pharmaceutical users. And they would be using everything, and they would be using a lot of IV. So once the market and once the police and the government started noticing this problem of pharmacies being stolen, they took measures, and with these measures, so of course these products were not so available, and these people had a problem to solve. And by then, more or less, the market started getting more organized, and the drug trafficking started also getting more organized, and there was more accessibility and availability of opiates. And there was actually in the city of Oporto a deliberate, intentional action of the drug market to remove cannabis and flood the problematic neighborhoods of the city with heroin. So when someone that just really wanted to smoke a joint would go to their regular dealer to buy some pot, they would be said, no, we don't have any, but we have this. It's horse. It's Carvalho, the street name for heroin at the time. So it's a brown stuff. You can smoke it also. You need to burn it. And this is actually how a big wave of unintentional opiate users initiated in mid-80s to late 90s in Portugal. We really started early in the methadone replacement in Portugal. Psychiatrist Edwin Lopes from Porto was doing his internship in New York in the Dolan Isvander group, where he actually took contact with the experimental program in methadone very early. And when he came home after his internship, he started the first methadone clinic in Porto around the time of 76, 77. So this was actually one of the first measures available. It was very polemic for a long time, but it was a strategy that was part of our system since very early on. Not with exactly a logic of harm reduction, but more as a treatment and maintenance strategy. But I will leave those differences also to Dr. José Padua, which will tell you also about this. So by end of the 80s, 90s, beginning of 2000s, this would be how it looked like in Porto area or in any other, or in Lisbon. These are Porto images. So we would have this important problematic neighborhood concentration in some parts of the city. They look just like any other use area looks like. Some of them would be in central historical neighborhoods of Porto. Some of them would be in periphery problematic neighborhoods. Some of them would be actually in very high valued states in key areas of the western part of the city, which are the ones that are associated with a higher income population. And the fact that this market is so pressured by real estate actually made the local authorities implode a number of these buildings. They were actually 5, but only 2 or 3 are left now. And without any other really programmed strategy to help people rehabilitate their life conditions and social conditions and health. So, before the law, where did we stand? So, we were subscribing international conventions since 1983, even though no systematic epidemiologic data were available about how extended was drug use. We were mass incarcerating very ill people. Actually, this was the most important problem. 50% of incarcerated addicted people had never had contact with any treatment options before they went to prison, so they ended up in the worst case scenario without being given any alternatives. 25% of them were keeping IVUs inside the prison with no access to sterile injection. In the city of Oporto in 2006, so still in the early years of the law, the epidemic on HIV, Hep C, and tuberculosis was pretty much on the rise. There were a number of inconsistencies. Repression was clearly the first measure. Drug traffickers could go to penalties that could be even in sometimes worse than in terms of jail time than attempted murder and actual murder. So there was clearly no distinction between selling drugs and killing someone. So a lot of problematic inconsistencies that gave rise to this first report. It was written by a group of specialists coordinated by this man. He had nothing to do with drugs. He was interested in biology, molecular biology, a gay man that came out of the closet in a moment in the Portuguese society. This was really unusual for someone with a good scientific reputation, so he was also very pioneer, very he managed this group very well, because this group had people that had very conservative views but also very progressive views, and he actually managed to do this balance between them very well. And so this national strategy report was out in '99, and it had important orientations. Among them was the recommendation that drug use should be decriminalized and that harm reduction should start being part of the national strategy. And this was actually put in practice very shortly after the report was issued. So there was a political interest in implementing these measures very quickly, and actually the law was ready in 2000, and it was implemented in 2001. And one of the measures that were to be implemented were the drug courts, or the dissuasion commissions. So it's actually a system where if you are caught with a quantity of a product that fits the limits that this table anticipates, then this will still be an offense, but it will be a minor civil offense, not a criminal offense, and there will be a number of reactions put in motion. So they will conduct these drug courts. They don't just have legal representatives; they also have social workers, psychologists. They will do a kind of motivational intervention, a short intervention. They will try to assess how far are you in into the drug use problem. They will decide on if you should be forward to treatment, even compulsively or not, or if you just go and present yourself periodically. So there's a number of alternatives here. You can also be asked to present yourself periodically. And so this started to have an impact in terms of the attention that our policy was attracting from internationally. One of the first things to be noticed was the fact that problematic drug use decreased very, very quickly. IV use and problematic use decreased very, very quickly. Of course, another important impact was the fact that people stopped being incarcerated because of solely being ill and having a problem with addiction. Cannabis use increased, but also the availability of treatment and prevention became also the first alternative for people with an addiction problem. And the drug-related deaths and the problematic use, as I said, were very noticeable. But the most perhaps interesting piece of evidence to convince policymakers was achieved in 2015 with this paper. This paper actually was done by economists, and it measured the impact, the social cost that the Portuguese strategy had had in Portugal since it was implemented. And they found out that just in the first years of the law, the public costs with health and legal and the legal system decreased 12%, and this increased to 18% in the first 11 years. So epidemiologically and looking retrospectively, what we know is that except for cannabis and LSD, actually, all substance use has decreased in Portugal over the last 17 years, and this is more so in the case of heroin use. So I need to finish. I'm far in my time, perhaps, I think. But I think that I wouldn't want to leave here also without giving you a critical perspective. And it is true that Portugal actually achieved very quickly and perhaps even pioneerly a point in the drug policy advances that is very praised by the international community, and there's good reason to support that. But it is also true that meanwhile, a lot of important things have been happening in drug policy international that we have not been able to keep up with. We've had an economical crisis in between this period. During that economical crisis, we had politically we also turned right. So it was already pretty amazing that during that period, the achievements from the previous drug laws were not compromised. So this was possible to be kept, even though the political climate changed considerably and the economical one as well. So I think that now that we've reached a different point, we need to definitely start being more ambitious, because there's important things happening in terms of evidence about psychedelic science and teacher plans. I think this is the point where the discussion about Ibogaine also needs to be taken into consideration for the Portuguese society and the new alternatives available. And we are still facing this, most importantly, a prohibitionist model. Okay, so I wouldn't want to live this presentation here without stressing it. It is still a prohibitionist approach. Drug use in Portugal is still illegal. It is interesting that the criminalization has reached all substance use, not just cannabis, and very early, but it is still a prohibitionist approach. So there's a lot yet to be conquered. So thank you very much, and excuse me for taking longer than...
Any questions for Maria? And thank you for taking me back to the 70s, my God.
Good afternoon, Maria. Yeah. Just two questions. Why do you think the use of cannabis and LSD did not decrease as for other drugs? And what this parliament approval of medicinal cannabis means in the actual reality, how people can get access to it?
I think that what happens in terms of epidemiology, and it was noticeable for the first period of epidemiology that was available after the law was implemented. It was pretty obvious that because use in Portugal, as in so many other countries, has to do mainly with cannabis use. So it was pretty noticeable that drug use started to be a more normalized behavior in the Portuguese society as in other Western and non-Western countries. And this was noticeable through cannabis because it is the most used substance. LSD has probably a different explanation. It could have to do with the popularity that some substances started having among specific environments associated with youth and raving and partying and festivals, etc. It has not been explained scientifically yet. But I think that this also means that decriminalizing in this sense has not meant that the measure has stopped substances from being used in the Portuguese society. It has stopped problems from increasing, definitely, and it has made problems more under control. So that was, I think, the way to answer your question with the available evidence. Then you were asking again, please. Okay, the medical cannabis. That's a debate that has a lot of unknown consequences yet, because the use of medical cannabis was approved, but nothing else has been decided yet. So we have no idea how will growth occur, if it will be forwarded over to companies to explore that field, or if it will be allowed for people to grow their own products. Of course, there's an important movement supporting the possibility that people grow cannabis, but this is going to be a very difficult achievement in the Portuguese society, probably to guarantee. So this is why I think that we must be cautious while evaluating our legal framework, because it is not without problems, and this is clearly one of those. Thank you, Rafael.
Thank you. My questions are, these, I think they're called drug dissuasion committees, yes? What is the procedure if someone, I think as we all know, most people who use drugs do not have a substance use disorder. Most people are able to use drugs without problems. What do the dissuasion committees do in the case where someone has offended but doesn't need treatment? And also, what is drug law enforcement like in Portugal? I know in the States it's very racialized. It falls on certain minority groups. Is that similar to how it is in Portugal?
The situation has had kind of a twisted consequence. It has brought attention to something that didn't really have that much public attention, that was cannabis use. So cannabis users started being much more under the attention of the police than they were prior to the dissuasion model being implemented. So the activity of the dissuasion commissions is mostly around cannabis users. That's the main motivation to get in contact with the police, and that's what police most easily notices when they spot drug use in the public space. So this is kind of a twisted consequence, no? Probably cannabis users would have been better off without so much attention, for sure. And again, sorry, I lost myself, Doug. What to do when someone is not an addict? Yeah, well, that's what happens with most people. No? Most people will not have a drug problem, a drug use, problematic use pattern. They will, but it is also true that these commissions have an important role to play when you spot young people who are in that risk profile, that they have perhaps some family dysfunction, they have some disruption in terms of their contact with school, they are also using substances, probably not problematically, but with some risk involved. And this social psychological approach can have an important role in noticing these profiles and giving them the appropriate recommendation for structures in the health system that may be able to help. Not exactly within the treatment system, but in other prevention teams that can actually be of service in assisting a youngster with this profile. However, if there is not exactly any of this risk involved either, it really, you can just go with, I don't know what's the word for it, demonstração, but it's like reprimand. It's probably... No, I think it's like a reprimand. No, a misdemeanor. A misdemeanor is a kind of offense. I think it's like a the infraction is a traffic ticket. Well, no, because you can actually get a fine. The law says that you can actually be asked to pay a fine for your drug use, but nobody is really implementing that. But that's in the law. That's possible. But these commissions, they do not apply it. So they use this reprimand. They use the forwarding for the treatment. They can make you do periodical presentations weekly in the commission, and they can and this is pretty much what it happens. If you get like an accumulated number of contacts with the drug court, it means that it can have different consequences at some point. But it is also, even if it's possible, it is not so. It doesn't really happen to have someone change from this minor offense system to criminal offense. Okay, so what determines that is really the amount that you have of possession. However, it is also argued that this limit is very low, and you can actually, of course, be in trouble with also a very low amount that doesn't really justify a criminal offense for trafficking. But it is what the law makes possible. Okay.
Really quick one, Dana, because we're leading into
around the world, the Ibogaine movement gets some resistance from the maintenance Ibogaine more.
Psychedelic medicine and teacher plants, and within that also Ibogaine and ayahuasca and other opportunities that are now being available. I think that evidence needs to be disseminated, and I think that even the most conservative representatives of the Portuguese drug system, they will not be able to ignore an accumulation of evidence shared within the Portuguese society intentionally. And as the Cosmic Air Association, that's really what we are also working for. Okay, to start a public debate around the potential of psychedelics and teacher plants, because that is a part of the issue around our society and our drug policy that is pretty much still falling behind. Once that evidence is made available, and once that communication has started intentionally within the Portuguese society, I believe we can actually start moving forward. But it's so underground at this point, and there's so little evidence available even to the people who are supposed to be well informed. It needs to be a debate, a public debate, and it has to be started, put in motion intentionally and quickly. And we at the Cosmic Air Association, we are really pushing efforts into starting this communication with systematic presence in the media, in large audience and mainstream channels in the media, and drawing attention to what we know already has enough evidence to convince any sort of people, not just the underground and open people for the potential of these tools.
Thank you very much. Round of applause for Maria, please. Sebastião, tens PowerPoint aqui. For Zé. Já está aqui no sistema? Okay. Have a look in the... Okay, she wants to hit the button. Which one is Padua? José, qual é? Como é que se chama este? Eu não estou a ver aqui. É o último aqui, PT Network Forum. É este? Ok, cool. Tá bom. Este aqui? Ok. Right, introducing José Manuel Padua. José, born in Lisbon, finished medical school of Lisbon University in October 1978. He is a hospital psychiatrist since 1986 and now with a degree in Assistente Graduado Senior. In June 87, he obtained the title Specialist in Psychiatry by the Portuguese College of Physicians. From 87, he worked in a clinic for the treatment and rehabilitation of drug addicts in downtown Lisbon, Centro das Taipas, an integrated center functioning in several areas as primary prevention, treatment, social and professional reintegration of drug addicts and training of professionals. He was active in the outpatient clinic, the emergency service and the inpatient clinic, where he acted as team coordinator for 2 years. From October 97, he worked in another center for treatment and rehabilitation of drug addicts in the east side of Lisbon, Cat de Chabregas, mainly in an outpatient clinic with a special concern for pregnant, addicted women. From 2006 to 11, he was a director of treatment and reintegration department at a Portuguese Institute for Drugs and Drug Addiction. From 2011, he has been working as a psychiatrist in 2 outpatient clinics for drug and alcohol addictions near Lisbon, and also at an inpatient clinic, a residential therapeutic community for addicts. Introducing José.
Hello, good afternoon. That link to the internet, to the CCAD, is where in English you can get epidemiological data about the situation in Portugal, about the treatments, about those inquiries that Maria reported. Every 2 years they make an inquiry in young people in the schools, and they have a national coverage on those inquiries. So we have new data every year, so we know the trends, what's going up and what is going down. My speech will complete what Maria said. I've been working. I work in the. I have worked in several of the institutions that are included in the national network. We had one big institution coordinating everything. Then a few years ago, they divided it smaller institutions. But we have yet the CCAD, and the CCAD means a coordinator, the national coordinator. So the treatments are separated by region. I'm going to show you the map in a few minutes. And but we have a national coordinator for the treatments, for the regulations, for the requirements, for the standards, and so on. And I think that the mainstream medical community is not aware of Ibogaine. Even if Benjamin was twice in Portugal showing his movie, and there was a conference about Ibogaine, but I think people on medical doctors are not aware of it, and maybe there is also some resistance because there is no medical evidence, no scientific evidence, or at least they think that there is not yet scientific evidence of the importance, mainly as we were speaking about opioid addiction and perhaps the use in the people that are on methadone. And we have yet several thousand people taking methadone or taking buprenorphine, another opioid, synthetic opioid, as a substitute for many years. So the National Institute with this name was working from 2002 to 2012 in the sequence of a previous one that launched the laws that Maria spoke about. And we have several areas of important of work in the community, like the prevention, the harm reduction, treatment, reintegration, and also this aspect of national coordination, normatives, research, and publication of data and publication of research. And also a conception of a national strategies that nowadays, since 2011, also includes the alcohol-related problems. So alcohol dependence, alcohol abuse, those people can also come to the consultations and come to treatment and so on. So we have outpatient clinics, we have daycare as a partial hospitalization, short-term hospitalizations like treatment for chronic intoxication and withdrawal, treatment of comorbid psychiatric conditions, and the residential therapeutic communities with treatments that go from 3 months to 12 months, sometimes even a little bit more, sometimes goes in difficult cases with psychiatric comorbid diseases. It can go up to 18 months residential treatment. In our outpatient clinics, the teams are composed of psychiatrists or general practitioners, nurses, social workers, psychologists, and psychosocial workers as the first contact with the public. We have several pharmacological programs, as I told you, with opioid agonists, but also with opioid antagonists. And we have directly observed dispensing of medication. So, I mean, people go to the centers. Some of them go every day. Some of them go twice a week, or even only once a week if they are working, for example, and they are out of using drugs. And they take the medicine, they take the opioid agonist in the presence of the nurses. And they take home doses for the rest of the week. And we were aware, and we gave much importance to the problems of diseases like hepatitis B, like hepatitis C, tuberculosis, and HIV. I'm going to show you some data about it. So nowadays, the network is composed of 46 outpatient treatment centers with an extra 32 smaller consultation units, 9 day centers, 2 of them are official and 7 are private, 13 detoxification units, 4 of them official and 9 private, 70 therapeutic communities, 3 of them official and 67 private. That was an option of the Ministry of Health some 15 years ago to make a contract with private associations or non-profit associations that run the therapeutic communities, and they pay for the patient. The ministry pays for the patient that are in treatment in those private communities. And we have nowadays 3 special oncological units, both of them with outpatient and inpatient clinics. This is a map of Portugal with the network that belongs to the Ministry of Health. It's distributed in all the main cities in Portugal and in the areas of Lisbon and Porto mainly. There was a big problem in the years 2000 or in the 90s and 2000. So there is a much important concentration of clinics in the areas of Lisbon and Oporto. You can see Oporto is here, this area, and this is Lisbon, the Lisbon area. Nowadays, we call the centers, we call integrated responses center because they deal with treatment, but they also deal with prevention, and they deal with reintegration. And they supervise the teams that work in harm reduction, mainly in the cities, in the bigger cities. These are the patients that in 2016 were involved in inpatients, either in detox units, and there was 1,187 in the Ministry of Health network. And in the therapeutic communities, you remember there were 70 of them, and 3 of them belong to the Ministry of Health, and 122 people were there in 2016. And in the private ones, the 63 private ones, it makes 3,490 patients during 2016. This is just to show the consultations. They are free, so people don't pay for the consultations in the centers of the Ministry of Health, neither the inpatients pay. And the bigger number of consultations were by the psychologists. They are the bigger number of technicians, of professionals in our network, and then the medical doctors, social workers, and consultations by nurses. The admissions, the number of new patients entering the network since the year 2000, and you see there was some fluctuations. Some of them were related to political options. Some of them were related to the opening of new centers. But there's always around 5,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 patients, new patients every year. Nowadays it's a little bit less, but nowadays we also have the alcohol patients. So alcohol patients in some areas, they make half of the patients nowadays. It's growing the awareness that our centers can treat the alcohol problem. So doctors are sending more patients, people are talking with each other and are searching for help in our center. So of the 4,000 new patients, almost half of them are alcohol problems, and only half of them are illicit drug problems. This is the percentage of people injecting drugs, using IV drugs, in the previous 30 days before the first consultation. And you see, before the law came out, in the year 2000, they were about 36% of new patients were using IV drugs, and it descended down to 7% in 2010, and it continued to descend down to 4% in the last few years. So this means also a descent of the problematic cases of HIV infection, because people don't use IV drugs, they don't share needles or syringes, and there are less problems. In the year 2008, this is the main drug of abuse of the new patients entering the network, asking for the first consultation. And you see that heroin counted for 60%, and 10% more were using simultaneously heroin and cocaine. Then you had cocaine, and just 10% were coming to consultation for cannabis problem. These are the figures for the last years, and you see on the left are people looking for consultation for the first time, and you see in white the cannabis, the percentage is growing, and nowadays is more than half of the new consultations of illicit drugs are on cannabis. So people are looking for help. We think there was a general idea that these centers were only for heroin problems, so that only people with heroin came to the centers. Nowadays, people accept better coming to the centers, so the alcohol patients nowadays come to the centers, the cannabis, people with cannabis problems come to the centers, and the new cases of heroin are a minority, are 25% heroin, 16% cocaine, and 54% of cannabis. But on the right side, you have the readmissions, people that were in treatment last year or several years ago, and they come back, they ask for help once again. And you see, for those who ask for help once again, heroin continues to be the main problem, even if cannabis is growing. year after year, but the cannabis importance is going, but heroin is the main cause of readmissions. This is the same on the left, the new patients, on the left, the readmissions, but this is the distribution of the age, by age of the people asking for a first consultation. And you see that on the left, the new admissions, the new patients coming asking for help, they have, it's growing the number of people with less than 25 years, less or equal to 24 years. As for the readmissions, they are a minority, 3-4%, and the people with more than 45 years old, they are more than 1/3 of the population with readmission. So the population for the heroin population is growing older every year, as do the medical doctors. They grow old every year, and so that is a problem because they have more diseases, they have more medical problems, and so it's difficult. They are more difficult to treat, the ones that continue to use heroin. This is a statistic I made with the inpatients, the problem with HIV positive in 2006. And you see for the total of patients, the HIV positive was 14.2, hepatitis B 2.3, and hepatitis C 61, almost 62 positive, 62% positive in the inpatients in this year. And I do means intravenous drug use. So the problem with the contagious was mainly due by intravenous drug use, but nevertheless there were some people were positive, and they said they never used intravenous. We don't know if the exact truth, they never used, or they used once or twice only, but they get infected anyhow. This is an image of the prevalence of co-infection, and you see that many people have 2 or 3 viruses active at the same time. Like hepatitis C, it's the major one in this population. This is a general population in an outpatient clinic, in case in all our outpatient clinics in the country for this 10 years. And this means they had hepatitis B, but they cured hepatitis B, but the smaller green one still has the hepatitis B virus in the body, and the pink one is the HIV. And you see there's a much important percentage of co-infection in these cases. This is the statistical of the HIV infection, and you see in black people that got the infection by intravenous drug used. The green one is the heterosexual, and the red one the homosexual. And you see from the year 2000 there was a sharp decrease in the number of new infections in HIV due to the decriminalization that brought more people to the consultations. People were not afraid to come and speak about their heroin problems because it was not a crime anymore, and due to the harm reduction strategies that I will speak in a few moments. These are the cases of infection and associated to drug use in red, and the gray area are the other cases of new HIV infections. And you see the cases related to HIV use are much lower nowadays, are just a small percentage of all the cases in Portugal. Also, the deaths by overdose, they are been decreasing during the years. That's great. And they are not very slow a number of deaths by overdose. So in risk prevention and harm reduction, there was for many years an important tool, an important area of work in this area. The policies should not only focus on reducing the risk of contagious diseases, but also prevent social exclusion and delinquency, as well as to promote conditions for motivating drug users to adhere to more structured treatment programs. This law was a law in 2001, so it was just a year after the law of decriminalization. And was this law that became legal, something that was going on, but a little bit discreet, in a discreet manner, that was the syringe exchange programs. They were before this law, but they were not legal. So this law became legal to promote these programs. So this goes on with the screening for infectious diseases and the information and sensibilization to risk prevention and harm reduction. The partnerships are the county structures, the Ministry of Health, non-profit organizations linked to drug addiction, and social support institutions. Specific geographic areas considered as problematic for consumption and for trafficking need reinforcement of the coordination between among partners. So we have now outreach street teams, 30 in the whole country, 6 mobile units that mainly are linked to the methadone programs, and these are special methadone programs because they are mainly focused in risk reduction, harm reduction. So people are not obliged to stop using drugs. They can continue in the program even if they are using. 2 boarding houses, 5 contact and information points, and 3 support centers. And these are some images of on the right side on the top is the mobile unit, so it's a small van that stops in each one stops in 4 different neighborhoods in Lisbon, and they give the methadone, so they have a timetable. People know when they are there, and they can go to have their methadone. It's drinkable. It's a liquid, and they have a small consultation cabinet where some days there is the doctor is there, and he can ask for contagious diseases analysis, or he can do the pulmonary chest the chest X-ray for the tuberculosis, to search for tuberculosis, because that has been a problem in Portugal. On the left, in the top left, it's a syringe exchange program. They put the used syringes in those special yellow boxes. In the bottom, you see a bus that also stops in Lisbon, and where people can go and ask for information about treatment centers and what can be done. And on the left side is one of those boarding houses where people stay for a few weeks preparing to go to the therapeutic community if they want to. And I'll finish with a memory of the Boom Fest, illicit drugs, but also on alcohol, because especially in the academic parties, there are many, many problems of young people drinking excess alcohol, even going in a coma to the hospital. It's very common. Thank you.
Okay, we have 3 minutes for questions to José Padua. Douglas, and I'll pass you over.
Thank you. One of the things we've noticed in the States is that we've had a lot of issues with adulteration with fentanyl, not just opiates, but with cocaine as well. Is that an issue here in Portugal?
No, I don't think so. We don't have reports of fentanyl in Portugal. Very, very scarce. No. For the moment, fentanyl is not a problem here.
Yeah, thank God. Thank you, doctor. That was really informative, and thank you for your compassion. It's great to hear about your work. My question was whether the people coming to your centers and stuff voluntarily or because of the interdiction, because of the new laws, the change in laws.
Most of them come voluntarily, yes. There are some cases referred because of the dissuasion teams, and they refer people to the, but in fact they are not obliged to treatment. They are obliged to go there once, and we explain them what can be the treatment, or what chances they have, what types of treatment, inpatient, outpatient, methadone, buprenorphine, etc. And we speak about it, and then they choose to continue or not to continue, yes. But answering to your question, sometimes the penalty is community service. Sometimes they use it as a penalty to do some 100 hours or 50 hours of community service for people that were were caught by the police using drugs, but they don't need treatment. They seem not to be dependent of it. And another aspect important of the dissuasion teams is to explain to young people that the drugs are prohibited. Even they are decriminalized, but they are prohibited anyhow, because there is some confusion about decriminalization and no prohibition at all.
Final question from Rafael.
Thank you. Just a curiosity, I saw the academic parties. In Brazil, now we have a lot of problems with these parties in the universities with alcohol. Young people are drinking a lot of alcohol in Brazil, and it's in huge quantities, distillated drinks, and that also is a reality here too. Just
yes, during the last, I would say, 10 years, it became a huge problem, yes. Most of them, in fact, drink beer or wine, but also some distilled drinks, some mixing with whatever, vodka or whatever. They don't like it. In fact, they don't like the taste of whiskey, or it's just to become drunk quicker. They mix the vodka.
Okay, a big clap for Dr. Padua, please. Right, Jeremy, I think we'll take a 5-minute break, and Dana's moderating Murtaza. Can we? Really? Oh. I've failed at my job. It's not what the paper says. Okay, so well, perhaps now we've got 3 wonderful people here on the panel. Why not open it up to some questioning and keep it rolling? Douglas.
I'm abusing privilege here, but there was a final part to my question to Dr. Carvalho that I asked before. In terms of drug law enforcement in Portugal, in the States it's very racialized, and I was wondering if you could comment on what drug law enforcement is like, either before and after the institution of the dissuasion committees here in Portugal.
I hope you got that.
Thank you, Douglas. I don't really have that much information on which I think can be indicative in some sense, because police attention to minorities for drug-related issues specifically is not commonly an issue in the media or in known occurrences in the public sphere. There is a racial issue, of course, mostly in more than it's quite more visible in Lisbon than it is in the northern part of the country. Racial issues are usually more related to violence and to problems in key urban areas that are afflicted with a number of other social problems. However, the fact that police is violently interacting with these communities for drug problems is not such a visible issue. On the other hand, there is this very interesting ethnography done in a prison setting that demonstrated over a long period of time that relations, communitary relations and family relations even among a prison environment, a carceral environment, actually reproduced what was happening in people's natural environments in problematic neighborhoods. So it was very common in a prison to have your family, your neighbors, your daughter, your mother-in-law, your sister, your cousin. If this is happening, it is clearly because police focuses their attention clearly in more areas than it does in others. So of course there's a bias. The racial issue itself is the one that I'm less sure about. I could tell you one thing, however. Because of the work that we do in Cosmic Air in Boom Festival, we get contact with a big international crowd. And we've had over the years a number of interactions that for some reason had to involve public authorities. And I do notice how frightened and worried people are every time police has to be involved for some reason. I even remember a case, for example, where someone had escaped the festival premises driving under influence and with even, the threat of wanting to do some harm to himself. And we had to involve the police because it was the easiest way to try and control the area around the festival, to try and spot the car and to try to keep the person safe. And this was something that we felt really comfortable doing because we trusted that no particular harm would actually happen to the person because the police was involved, quite by the contrary. And this was not at all the representation that people, especially foreigners, usually have. I'm not saying that we don't have mistakes by police. Of course, we have high number of those anywhere, including Portugal. But I do, personally, I can actually trust that if I have a problem, I can actually involve an authority to try to solve it. It could be that I'm a woman and I'm white and I'm educated and that they're less threatening to me than they are to a person with different characteristics. But the racial issue is something that I don't really have a lot of experience with, and it could be somehow explanatory. This is, I'm sorry, the best I can answer your question.
Any further questions? Mr. Beale.
Well, since there are more questions, right? You talked about a certain time when there was some kind of effort to substitute opiates for cannabis. You said, well, there was a certain time where the cannabis was cut off and the dealer was offering, right? When was that and why was that?
I actually kind of lived through that period. This was like mid-90s. End of 80s, this started. Well, no, no, I'm not that old. I actually lived the full-blown heroin epidemic when I was in high school. So earlier in the late 80s, this intentional strategy started. It was very noticeable where I studied, because I studied in a deprived urban high school in the oriental part of Porto, who lived this pressure very directly and very intensively. The reason for that has been explained by sociology and anthropological studies done in those areas, because for the risk of being in prison and criminalized for drug trafficking, it would be way more profitable to traffic for heroin than it was for cannabis. So it was a clearly economical strategy of risk evaluation for the drug market.
Okay, can we get some new faces asking questions? Oh, lovely. Hello. Your name is?
I can introduce myself. My name is Anna. That was a very nice response, just because I asked a question. Well, thank you. I'm wondering, it seemed like cannabis was an interestingly high percentage of people asking for help. And I think that's so interesting. I'm a doctor and therapist from Sweden in psychiatry, and I think that the risks of cannabis are... I'm working in the emergency. I meet a lot of young people who get in trouble in different ways. And so my respect for cannabis has really increased. But I don't know that much because I'm from Sweden and we're really bad with this stuff. We really don't know a lot. So enlighten me, please.
It's directed at Dr. Zeh.
I would say that nowadays cannabis on the market, on the street market, is stronger than it was a few 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And the number of cases with psychotic reactions, psychotic problems increased quite a lot, yes. And we think that probably the main problem is the content of THC in the cannabis. It's tripled from the test. Chemical tests show it tripled from 20 years ago, and that makes a problem. Anyhow, I'm showing their percentages. So, but the numbers increase. The absolute numbers increase. In fact, one of the reasons. There was also a time when young people started smoking cannabis at a younger age, and that increases the problems also, psychiatric problems, other psychotic or other problems that increase. And another issue is maybe in schools, the psychologists that work in schools, give support to the problems in school, are more attentive and look for it, and they send more young people to consultations because they detect the problem. But I would say the main problem is the content in THC.
Round of applause for our expert panel, please. Mr. Beale, this is yours.
I'm going to go to the bathroom.
He went to the toilet. I will talk maybe 17 minutes. It's not a long.
All right, folks, we're starting the next presentation.
Stand up or talk like this? But I don't need a point.
They want me to start, so if you could kind of stop talking to each other in the back of the room, sit down. We're going to be getting to stuff that I myself have been working on. This is about 2 places where we're trying to do stuff with Ibogaine. Afghanistan and Nepal, and they're linked because we decided that it would be easier to open in Nepal, and the example of that might soften up the authorities in Afghanistan. And Murtaza found a fellow who's supposed to be here, but he couldn't get a visa, named Santosh Shah, who had the connections of the government in Nepal to get us licensed to open a clinic there. And this is actually about to happen. And it's pretty important because Nepal, Kathmandu, is a pilgrimage destination for Buddhist and Hindu pilgrims. So there's flights from many major Indian cities to Nepal. And there are 1 billion people in India, 8 million heroin addicts, 300 million middle-class people, the middle-class standard of living. So some of those are middle-class heroin addicts. That means they can probably pay about as much as Anwar is charging or was charging in South Africa, which is somewhat less than Tijuana. So, of course, the thing that's been, kind of on the front burner and we've been trying to do for a long time is bring Ibogaine to Afghanistan itself. There was a BBC special that I still have somewhere on a disc that showed the bridge over the river in Kabul. And there is just this huge concentration of people doing heroin under that bridge. And I thought, this is as close, when I saw it, I said, this is as close to hell on earth as anything I've ever seen. Right? So there was somebody in the video, a kid that was being treated, and 2 days into the treatment, which consists of cold turkey. That's what it is. That's the treatment. You kick heroin with unassisted. I don't think they even give them benzos. But after 2 days, he ran away And it was really tragic because he had his mother out there begging to pay for his heroin. And I thought, this could never would have run away if he'd been dosed with Ibogaine, because he couldn't have gotten up to run away, and then when the Ibogaine wore off, he wouldn't be in the throes of withdrawal. So withdrawal is still a huge obstacle to ordinary people getting off of heroin. And you have a lot of people in Afghanistan are addicted, but a lot of them are really young, relatively healthy men who could do Ibogaine and then become productive for their families again instead of sending their mom out to beg in the street. So I'm going to turn this over to Murtaza, who's going to talk about both Afghanistan and what we're planning to do there, and Nepal and what we're planning to do there, since he's, the person who made it.
I'll just. So, hello everyone. This is Murtaza. Well, basically, I will talk on Afghanistan today, but the idea what Dana was explaining is mainly, so it started with Dana, thanks to Dimitri and Anwar, who was part of this whole process, which we started. Anwar and Dimitri is not here. But so mainly the idea is that Afghanistan, considering the context of drug use and social political problems, it's mainly that we are going to do some trials, and then with the help of ICRs, we're going to do some small researches, and then talk about safety, and then provide new ways of doing treatments. But with Nepal, it's totally practice. We have obtained already the license to open an official clinic. Yeah, to open an official clinic in Afghanistan, in Nepal. But I'll just go through quickly to what Afghanistan is about and why Ibogaine for Afghanistan. So basically, these are the first people who got methadone in Afghanistan. And that's a historic picture for me because it was me and my organization who brought the methadone. So just as a nostalgia or memory. Yeah. So, I mean, we all might know that Afghanistan is this country which produced 92% of opium in the world, plus 50 to 60% of hashish or cannabis produced. Discussions have been a lot in the news that Afghanistan is problematic with drugs and war and security, but then there's less and less discussions happening about people using it, which is also huge. And each year there's more than 700 tons of opium is produced, and 10% is used internally by the population themselves. So there is a big number of people addicted to heroin or opiates, opium mainly, but there's no discussion. So there had been only no research. There had been only one small research which shows that 350,000 people use opium, but it has increased 75% over the 2005 to now, which is like mainly we have 14% of our population hooked on heroin, women, children, young people. And then Afghanistan is a country which has 75% of their population below 30 years old. So it's mainly young people addicted to heroin with no solution, no infrastructure, and plus all the risks involved with drugs, HIV.
How many methadone slots are there?
I'll come to that. I'll come to that. Yeah. Yeah, I'll come. So, treatments available in Afghanistan. Mainly, we have the simple detoxification, which is, as Dana said, it's cold turkey, symptomatic treatment of opioid addiction. So mainly giving them painkillers like Brufen, some antihistamines just for the rainy nose and stuff, but nothing else except cold turkey and kind of motivational talking, spiritual talking, that you are evil, the evil should get out of you. So this is the setup of detox in Afghanistan, which doesn't tackle it all methamphetamine. It's only, the protocol is only a 45-day of treatment for people who use heroin. And people with meth and heroin, which is 90% of drug users now in the streets, doctors don't know how to deal with them and how to deal with, I mean, with meth we don't know how to deal with it anyway, but still there's no real knowledge about meth addiction in Afghanistan. So this is how the situation has built up, and this is how we thought like bringing Ibogaine would be another name in the menu of treating addicts on heroin and meth. So how does it look like? It will be a low threshold center for Afghanistan with the plans of scaling it up. What we mean is that first, the idea is that we will show the government upon their request to treat 10 people and demonstrate the government how the treatment of Ibogaine works. And then we would, the success of that 10 treatments will lead us to scaling up the center and to bring more knowledge and more diversification in the knowledge of Ibogaine from Afghanistan. But what we are aiming mainly is that, for us, for the team we are working in Afghanistan, or Dimitri and others, it's mainly that we are trying to integrate Ibogaine into a harm reduction model rather than a clinical treatment model, because a few reasons. First, drug users don't like clinical setup. If you we all know why, but otherwise, putting people out of heroin and kicking their addiction out and leaving them back on the streets is not what we are aiming at, because there's no real infrastructure, there's no social care, and heroin is the only tool for people to deal or cope with the stigma and discrimination happening in Afghanistan. So taking heroin from a person who has been living with it for 10 years means we are opening him up to different traumas that he has been coping with, which needs harm reduction approach mainly. So from what we are doing now with our center, it's we're trying to expand it to a more drop-in center where drug users would come, they would take psychosocial counseling, they will have psychotherapies, and they will have different approaches of harm reduction rather than only HIV prevention. And then once they're ready, the model will continue to introduce Ibogaine as an addiction breaker and then work with it afterwards. So, I mean, because Afghanistan, although we have no real data and research about anything, but we follow WHO, World Health Organization, a lot. So the model which we are trying to implement should be compatible to WHO, which means that, okay, that will be considered as a detox, because detox is the only way to deal with addiction in Afghanistan. But also there's a manual of WHO which is called Psychosocially Assisted Treatment for Opiates. This is the manual we will follow afterwards, after the sessions, which comes. So mainly, it's 1 week of preparation, or maybe more. We still don't know. It depends on how we will develop the protocol afterwards. 7 days of inpatient initiations of Ibogaine dosage, and then we are thinking to have this 6 months of psychosocial care for opiate users, which means family therapy, psychotherapy, and social care, job searching and stuff, so that they got integrated back to society. And also, but it's a first plan. We still don't know which method will work yet, but still we're working, and then we're trying to learn by doing in Afghanistan. Yeah. And why Ibogaine we considered for Afghanistan could be useful is, first, there's no solution in Afghanistan for addiction of drugs. Then the mindset of people is mainly that people should be detoxed. And then Ibogaine, like introducing OST would require more time for us to convince the government, because opiate substitution therapy, rather than giving them a medicine or a drug which detoxify people, which is easy to argue on the table with people. So that's mainly, we think Ibogaine is implementable in Afghanistan. And then of course, a social culture setup of Afghanistan for addiction. It's a very stigmatized thing to use drugs or to be addicted to heroin, but once the family or the society knows that this guy's on recovery and he's going to take treatment, then there's more support and family and social support happens. So these are the main reasons we think Ibogaine should work in Afghanistan as it works in other parts of the world. And So step forwards, thanks to ICRs, we are doing dose safety dose research on trials on 10 people, which were really the people who would take the flat dose afterwards. Which before coming here, I submitted to IRB, Institutional Research Board. Depending on their timing, we will get the license, and then hopefully by spring we have the first batches taking Ibogaine in Afghanistan. Yeah. And that's all. And then the whole idea after this 10 people is that to build a center where it could be trained. We can train other Afghans from different provinces, and then they can come and learn and then start duplicating the model of treatment which we were building. Yeah. So, yep, open to any question. Thanks. Thanks. Okay, so I mean, you would like to talk about it? Yeah, well, Janice will talk about the ICR's research a little bit. Harm reduction psychotherapy. Yeah, that's the Turkish. Well, that's one of the books. I mean, but there's, yeah, no, it's like the whole model of full spectrum harm reduction. We're trying to, yeah. So right now there's only 700 people taking methadone in the whole country, which has 3.5 million of drug users, and still people are not convinced. The government doesn't like methadone because they say they still use drugs. So yeah, that's the situation or scenario. And Janice?
Hi. Yeah. I'm Janice. I'm working with ICERS, and well, I will explain briefly the protocol that we developed. Thank you, Murtaza, for your presentation, and thank you, Dana, for moderating the young ones in this forum. So, I have only this slide because this speak was quite improvised. But I will expose briefly the protocol that we built with Murtaza. In that project, Murtaza explained us how was the situation in Kabul a little bit, what had in mind, and what was the available options and resources he have. And well, taking into account all this information, we realized that it would be great to answer very basic questions in pharmacology research that have not addressed in the past. Just for example, which is the dose, which is the Ibogaine dose, which is the minimum dose that cannot produce any adverse events. This is the thing that minimum intolerated dose. Excuse me for my English. I hope you can understand everything. This is there are these two things. For example, minimum effective dose, that is the lowest dose that can produce a therapeutic response, and maximum tolerated dose, that it is the dose that can produce serious adverse events. So we don't know now the Ibogaine dose, which is safe and which is effective. So with this kind of clinical trial, we wanted to answer this question. So the protocol, as Murtaza said, will recruit 10 people with heroin dependence. The first, all the patients will be switched off to morphine, in the beginning of the trial. And then the first 2 participants will receive 150 milligrams of Ibogaine. And we established 2 different kind of endpoints. We have the efficacy and the safety objectives. And we will consider a safety Ibogaine dose, that dose that will not produce any adverse event in any of these 2 first patients, participants. And we will consider effective dose, that dose that can eliminate the withdrawal symptoms for the next 24 hours after the administration of Ibogaine. So after these two first participants, if no serious adverse events appear, and if we do not have evidence of the elimination of withdrawal symptoms for the next 24 hours, we will include the next two participants with the 300 milligrams of Ibogaine, and we will observe if this is a safety dose or this is an effective dose. This dose will be increasing until 750 milligrams of Ibogaine. But if we find a safety and effective dose in each of these 4 doses, we will stop the escalating dosing, and we will include the following participants in the effective and safety dose. So the objective is maybe to stay at 300 or 500, because we think from other sources of evidence that 750 100 milligrams of Ibogaine will be quite risky. So we are planning to especially observe these two intermediate doses. And this is the protocol. We hope to, as I said, to answer these questions in basic pharmacology. And I don't know if you have any doubt or something. I just wanted to expose very briefly the idea that we have. So, yeah, that's all. Thank you.
I would also point out, if you really have a population where everybody's speedballing meth along with their Ibogaine, Ibogaine is about the only thing that will work for that population. The other really great thing about Afghanistan is it isn't a situation like New York where everybody is doing Xanax with their methadone. As we know, benzos complicate an Ibogaine treatment, and we have a whole country that's largely benzo naive because they're just too poor to afford. They're too poor to afford methadone, and they're too poor to afford benzos. So it, in some ways, is a perfect laboratory experiment.
So it's not mainly because of being poor, but it's the culture of differentiation of drug and medicine. So there's two separate words for it, drugs and medicine. So they're not into habit of taking medicine because they say they're not sick, so they don't take tablets. But heroin and others are like drugs they're using. So one reason which pharmaceuticals is not famous in Afghanistan is the medicine part of it, which people are not very happy to use.
But I have a book around here somewhere, which naturally I gave to the lady from Canada. But there's a passage in the book, actually in the very beginning of the book, it's a long quote from Naked Lunch. And William Burroughs talks about if you have a pyramid of numbers, right? And he says there's a load of pyramids in the world, and the common thing is everybody on the bottom is thin and exploited, and everybody on the top is fat and rich. And he says if you want to get rid of a pyramid of numbers, you take out the lowest number of the pyramid, and the entire thing goes out of existence. The lowest number in the pyramid is the junkie who must have heroin, the junkie on the street who must have heroin to live. And we came up with this drug because we were cannabis users, and we saw more than one situation where our nice cannabis was suddenly replaced by heroin, and a lot of people got into heroin. We developed this drug not to overthrow the government. We were yippies, so we were into overthrowing the government, but to overthrow heroin. We developed it to change the hierarchy of drugs so that marijuana would be a little stronger and heroin would be a little bit weaker. So, yeah, are there questions?
There's another Dana in the audience. Taz, Murtaza, thank you for doing what you're doing, and the clinical slide is actually really interesting. I don't know enough about the medicine. My question for you was, can you say a little bit more about what you were talking about, the why it's culturally acceptable to use this? So the Ibogaine is a drug, and it's acceptable in your culture. Not okay.
So, like I said, medicine is always a clean thing in our society, and doctors have this nemesis, I would say, that they control everything. So promoting Ibogaine as a medicine to quit drugs or break your addiction is the way. Africa, which hallucinates you and then it quits drugs. This is Illuminati for Afghan setting, you know. But medicine and detoxification is more accepted. But what happens inside, we cannot reveal that. Still, there's risk of there's no risk of like putting us in jail or whatever. But still, we need to be cautious at the beginning. Who we select as a client at the beginning. I'm talking because like I said, the success of this 10 people is the success of Ibogaine story in Afghanistan. Otherwise, there will be no Ibogaine. Yeah.
Murtaza, I was wondering if you could say anything about patterns of opioid use in Afghanistan. I mean, this is a country that is one of the biggest producers of opium, which, you know, is a number one. And, you know, smoking opium is a lot different than injecting opioids. Is there still any culture of opium use, or has it been completely overtaken by more purified, potent forms of opiates?
Thank you very much. Okay, so there was a drink called, literal translation of it would be happy drink. And it used to be drunk during ceremonies of wedding or parties like New Year. They would dance around the fire and then they would use it. Happy drink, yes. So basically it's the poppy buds making tea from it. But then opium was, I mean, it's still in families. There's still this medicine part of it where if I feel coughing, my mom will take out a tiny bit of opium, digest it, and sleep. Like even for a 3-year-old kid, they would give it. But since the war happened and since the drug war shifted its focus in Afghanistan, and because of the drug war, there has to be heroin produced. So now people are using more and more heroin because it's easily available. It's easy to smoke because for opium, mainly it's the smoking, and the smoking needs a lot of time. You need to have a nice coal, and you know the process is very what's it called for king? Royal. Like opium is supposed. Yeah, so it's very royal way of using opium, the way they use with the chillum and stuff. But as a junkie way, it's heroin and chasing the dragon or shooting. Yeah.
You mentioned starting sort of like a drop-in center and scaling up. Do you have funding for that part of the process, or interested parties and whatnot?
So we have the mobile drop-in center, which we have funding until March, but looking forward for some funding next year, but not yet. We're not sure yet. but that's the plan, and that's where we're going for fundraising. Like there will be, we have some strategies built to how to work with fundraising, how to engage people. Like because the problem with Afghanistan is that the whole harm reduction concept comes with HIV component. And if it's not HIV, there is no money for harm reduction. So there's like, if you see the whole circle of drug policy in Afghanistan, harm reduction is just a tiny bit, which only focuses on HIV. So we're trying to aim other donors who doesn't involve themselves in HIV, but more on development and drug. So hopefully, yeah.
Is the quality, what is the quality of the heroin that people are using? What? Okay, so so you have strong, both injected and pure? Okay. So not dealing with cut or...
Most people, they call it like the laboratory mices. They just hang out around the laboratories which produce heroin, and they just live, and then they test the quality all the time. So they're living out of the quality. So there's no, like for example, traveling, working with harm reduction around the world, the only country which you can put your brown sugar in a distilled water, shake it and shoot it is Afghanistan. You don't need to cook your heroin. You just shake in the water and melt it. Yeah.
Has the weight of the client or the patient been determined or factored into your dosing protocol?
Yeah, well, we did not consider this information at the beginning, but we established this this kind of safety protocol using 2 participants in each escalating dose, and if more than 50% of patients, I mean one more, if 2 of these participants are suffering some adverse events, coming or not from things like we cannot control in this case, like weight, we will administer the previous dose, you know, just to.
Okay, we have to stop really. We've got one more. Just a quick one.
Are these going to be people with fairly small short-term habits? Because it doesn't seem like those doses will be enough to break habits. And if people are still sick, are you going to re-administer opiates? Or how are you going to keep people from using and avoiding adverse events?
So do you mean by this safety dosage trials or the whole process of initiation? Well, they will go home and use their drug back. But ideally, we would try to prescribe them morphine, but also with a very controlled way because it reduces the tolerance so that they don't overdose and all this stuff. So we will take this in consideration. That's how it's written in protocol. Yeah.
And that's something.
Yeah. So once it's defined that this is safe. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks very much. Great panel. Has anyone got any ibuprofen or something for a headache? Okay, great. 10-minute break and then our final panel. No, it's just one panel.